um, sort of like take a little time to reflect on, actually talking for ourselves here, reflect on what are we doing here and what brought us here, and perhaps engage the whole Macalester community into developing a vision of this next year for us that just started.
Well, maybe we should start by introducing ourselves.
Perhaps.
Okay, do you want to start?
My name is Cecilio Ortiz Garcia. I am a professor of political science at the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez. And for the last decade or so, maybe even more, I've been doing research alongside my wife and colleague, who will have an opportunity to present herself, on the areas of energy, electric systems, energy transitions, and the governance of those transitions for a more just and sustainable future.
And my name is Marla Perez Lugo. I am an environmental sociologist by training, and I am a professor of sociology at University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. But we are here at Macalester for this year as Hubert Humphrey visiting professors. We have been very lucky to find a space at Macalester to learn from you and to share our experiences, mostly after Hurricane Maria impacted the island of Puerto Rico. So I think we were waiting for Dr. Patke, but if Anne gives us the okay, I think
I'm actually here.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My apologies. Some habits are really hard to break, like starting Envirothursday at 12 o'clock. Decades later, you just can't get that out of your system. So thank you for getting the ball rolling. I see that you've begun to introduce yourselves. It's my pleasure to welcome Marla and Cecilio to Macalester, and also to welcome you all back to the first Envirothursday session of the new academic year. I will try to do a little formal introduction in a second. But before we do that, I was hoping that you all could join me in wishing a very happy birthday to Anne Essen. It's coming up in a couple of days. So happy birthday, Anne, from all of us.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Seeing that there's 30 of us on this Zoom call, I'm going to suggest we skip the singing version of our happy birthday wishes. I think that could be less than melodious. So Anne, happy birthday from all of us. And with that, I'm delighted to tell you a little bit more about our Hubert Humphrey visiting professors for this year. Cecilio, both actually, Marla and Cecilio, come to us from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. I think they have mentioned that already. Professor Garcia's PhD is from the University of Arizona State University, ASU, in the field of environmental policy and public administration. Professor Marla's PhD is in the field of environmental sociology from Rutgers University, but they share many common interests, as you've likely heard in their introduction, around questions of energy transitions, around energy and environmental justice, around thinking about community resilience. And in this talk today, you'll hear more, not just about their personal projects, but how they hope to create a national and international network of scholars to aid in disaster interventions. And so we're so delighted that you're here with us this year for this most unusual year. And they will speak, and I will help facilitate the question period. I encourage you to use the chat for your questions for either of them during the course of their presentation. And then I will help facilitate a more open question session. And at that point, I'll ask you to use the raise hand symbol so that I can call on you for a question. I'll also be a timekeeper, Marla and Cecilio, and what I'll do is put in the chat maybe when we're about a half an hour in, so that you have a sense of the time. It's really hard to keep track on Zoom. Also, I hope for all of you out there, you can appreciate my virtual background, a nod to Marla and Cecilia's home today. Thank you, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much for this introduction. And thank you for welcoming us in such a warm way to Macalester College.
Yeah, if it's, you know what, if we could start sharing the, I would really like to just give you a moment to briefly. I don't know if you are a Star Wars fan.
Let's ask, how many of you are Star Wars fans?
Yes, can we see a show of hands there? There you go.
Okay, okay.
All right.
So you know what a Mandalorian is. Okay, excellent.
Or pretends to be, as his world or changes around him. The I wanted actually to go to the second to the last, and briefly to the second to the last.
The last?
Yes, and I just wanted to start reflecting on this phrase right here, and this has nothing to do with the fact that at the same time, Dr. Perez Lugo and myself engage in an academic career on our own, and also engage in the, let's say, guidance of a family unit between us. The complexities of managing those two worlds at the same time, as many of you might already know, and those of you might not, but that's what sharing experiences is all about. It's going to become more and more of a way of life for academics. The 21st century, it's being called the century of relational science. After years and years of STEM policy direction and the emphasis on industrial processes and the role of educational development in industry and economic development and modernization, and actually the colonization of many of those educational and scientific processes, we are now becoming more soft than hard. We are now engaging in what we used to call the soft side of sciences, and the hard sciences are more and more being challenged and more being questioned as the answer for sustainable transitions in society. Are we moved into transitions by technological innovation, or have we until now given too much emphasis on that and left behind the relational innovation, the social innovation necessary, and the relationship necessary for, as a scientific community and as an academic community, make a concretely effective intervention in this some say wicked experience we are living right now. So that being said, and having shown you this at the beginning, I just wanted to leave that simmering in you, because it's going to permeate everything we say.
Well, given that Cecilio already gave away the punchline of the presentation, now we can start from the beginning. The title of our presentation is Observing the Observer, Challenging the Mandalorian Ethic of University Interventions in Disasters. And of course, most of you know what a Mandalorian is. That is absolutely great for our purposes. As Ropali said, we come from Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is an island, well, an archipelago in the Caribbean. And as part of our task and our job at University of Puerto Rico, and this is important for the rest of our presentation, we co-founded the National Institute for Energy and Island Sustainability. This is the main island of Puerto Rico. University of Puerto Rico has 11 campuses all across the 100 miles by 35 miles of the main island. And INESI, as we call it in Spanish, is a convergence platform that includes about 90 faculty members across the 11 campuses, representing 23 different academic disciplines, from electrical engineering to community psychology, to social work, to economics, etc.
So INESI, we introduce you to the concept of INESI in the context of INESI being our Mandalore. Let me give you some context. As social scientists in what is tantamount to Puerto Rico's A&M University, or its land grant with the predominantly engineering and agricultural science emphasis. Social science is what it's considered a service department. That is, it services those main units in the university in terms of the necessities for their accreditation and their educational development. So that right there starts telling you the kind of world some disciplines live in other academic worlds. These are worlds that are very hierarchical. These are worlds that are very unidisciplinary determined in terms of that hierarchy. And as you could imagine, the fiscal structure, the decision-making structure, and the actual life of some disciplines in those types of contexts is extremely precarious. So we as social scientists that wanted to cross over and collaborate in what we call socio-technical systems analysis and study and socio-ecological systems analysis, we had to create our own world in order to be recognized, in order to be able to boundary span among different disciplines. And we had to create an institute to be able to develop our research agenda. And that was INESI.
So this is the agenda for today's talk. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about Hurricane Maria, which was the trigger for our work since its impact in September 20th of, well, almost there, of 2017.
We are almost there.
The second point is the parachuting, and we will explain more in a little bit, the Mandalorian ethic, reflecting on our experience, and then what we have been developing as a network of universities, an inter-university collaborative convergence platform to change the way in which universities intervene with communities in disasters. So Hurricane Maria impacted Puerto Rico, but as any other disaster, the causes, the root causes for the damage were not only placed on the strength of the event. It was a Category 5 hurricane. However, there were a lot of pre-existing conditions that caused almost 3,000 deaths related to the impact of this phenomenon. From debt and austerity measures, the colonial relationship with the United States, the privatization of hospitals, communications, and main roads, a fiscal control board that passed judgment over the use of fiscal resources in Puerto Rico for all purposes, making decisions of policy that should elected officials be doing. The institutional capture by two main political parties, and an electrical system based on fossil fuels, very dense generation, concentrated, and an environmentally unjust configuration. And this is important because the main issue after Hurricane Maria was the total collapse of the electrical system. This is the route, that the trajectory that Hurricane Maria took over the main island. And if you can see there, one of the issues with Puerto Rico's electrical system is that the generation plants are established in the coast, mostly in the southern coast of the island, but most of the loads or the consumption is based on the northern side of the island. And by the Hurricane Maria to cut across the island in that way, it cut the main line that connected the generation with the consumption. So the total collapse of the system was the immediate consequence of that impact.
Sometimes it's good to use numbers, even though most of our research is not quantitative, because they do give you some measure of the kind of severity brought by this extreme operating environment. So when we look at the destruction of the electric system, and we now look back 3 years back at its recovery and reconstruction, not even going past the recovery period yet. I'm going to repeat that. We're going to celebrate 3 years after Hurricane Maria landfall in Puerto Rico. We're still in recovery. The worst record you want to be in the Guinness Book of Records is the longest blackout in U.S. history, and we have achieved that. The measurement unit for this record is consumer hours of lost electric service. We call them choles, and 3,000 million choles is the current record. That, if you put it in terms of days, the full recovery of electric service to the population was achieved after 329 days. So, as you know, everything we do, everything we value, everything of substance to the survival and the health and well-being of human populations goes through your energy capabilities and your access to energy, more importantly. So when the lights went off, communications went off, the hospitals went off, transportation was impaired, education, water service, food service, and as you put that together, you then have a better picture of how, even though we saw a lot of manufactured ignorance being utilized in the media information and communication of how many deaths were associated with the event. We, in the end, we come to the realization that about 3,000 deaths are now associated with the impact of Hurricane Maria.
And the most important point to remember here is that approximately 2,000 families bear the brunt of those 3,000 deaths. And those were the families that were left without electric service for almost a year.
A point that I could never end stressing to my students in my energy justice class.
So because we were ready, we had the institute and we had the knowledge and the know-how to help reestablish the electrical system. In fact, to help reimagine a more resilient, less vulnerable electrical system, we went to our government. And this is what we found. The emergency operations were located in a hotel environment. The whole island was without electricity, but they had air conditioning and they had mechanical stairs and they were segregated from the local press. The thing is that the conditions in which decision makers were located were completely different to the conditions that the rest of the people were located.
It was a bubble. It was a bubble. It was doubly hurting for us because right at the doors of this place, which by the way, we had to enter illegally, and we were not let in, even utilizing our ID. That's how ironclad this place was in terms of security.
Well, if we forget that,
well, you know, let's be candid about it. There were people outside clamoring for water, for clamoring for supplies, mm-hmm. and these people in here were actually segregated and stratified in ways that reflect social stratification in Puerto Rico in itself. That first floor you see there had the local press, which is as far as we got when we went in there. You took electrical stairs to the second floor that was host to the local government apparatus and the foreign press and the international press and the U.S. press. So again, separation between the U.S. press and the Puerto Rico local press. And up in the third floor, you had then FEMA and the Corps of Engineers. So that stratification visually and us being observed as we went into this building as foreigners to this process allowed us to start using our training about field observations, our own training as social scientists, to then start getting ourselves in our world of being observers of the observer. So we'll go further into that.
So what we did was to start working with mayors in the mountain region, those communities that were left without electrical service the longest, creating and developing kiosks, solar kiosks with our colleagues in engineering, so people could recharge their equipment, phones, etc. So the thing is that while we were doing that, we start seeing many universities from the United States parachuting into the island to do one of three main things. Some of them were doing humanitarian aid through service learning activities that were helping cleaning up some of the roads and some communities. Some other universities were doing study abroad type of activities, bringing students to use the disaster as a classroom. And some other universities were doing disaster research. And immediately we found 6 main issues with these university interventions. The first one is the interventional ignorance.
Yeah, let's categorize and actually define um, that epistemology of ignorance. We are obviously talking about a condition where you do not know what you do not know, as opposed to a condition where you know what you know, or at worst, your condition of uncertainty, which is you know what you don't know. That if that sounds confusing, it's very confusing, but it's just I want you to understand, when we call interventional ignorance, we are not calling institutions of higher learning ignorant in the sense of an absence of knowledge. Ignorance is not the absence of knowledge. Actually, ignorance is a tool utilized to redistribute power in terms of how you organize and share knowledge. So it comes from ignoring, not knowing. So a lot of levels of ignorance are manufactured and are imposed in a war to dominate the power of who decides what is knowledge, how it's organized, and who has access to it or not. So when we talk about interventional ignorance, for the sake of the intervention, knowledge is structured in a certain way to be able to abilify, to be able to make possible interventions under scientific terms that really in the 21st century left us thinking about those interventions. There's a few things about this. As you see these colors in the map of Puerto Rico, those interventions were not equally distributed in the landscape of the island. And you had a phenomenon that we now call, charismatic municipalities or charismatic localities, where the capacity of a non-governmental organization or community organization to be able to have a web page or to be able to utilize the internet to advertise or to crowdfund or to let you know a little bit of what they were doing, it becomes a tool for the interconnection of researchers with those localities that are already through that observation of their web participation, higher levels of organizational structure, and it's sort of a guarantee that the investment that the university is going to be making will reward the university back, because you will not be just dropping in anywhere, but on an organized already place. So that's what we mean by interventional ignorance: the willful ignoring of aspects, factors, variables that should be taken into account, to only concentrate on what's functionally viable in terms of interventions.
The second issue we found was the academic work and research was based on competition and extraction. And in some ways, universities from the mainland were hired even by our government to do work that University of Puerto Rico and local universities were already doing. And I put this in the slide because this is the report of George Washington University about the deaths related to Hurricane Maria. And the data that was presented on that report was collected by the Medical Health Campus by University of Puerto Rico, but it was published by George Washington University instead, not the UPR.
So there's worse examples than that, and we can one of the things about observing the observer is, it it really brings out in your field notes and your observations things that call upon reflection. For example, we had a direct contact encounter with what we call colonial science when we were introduced to the RAND Corporation's visit to our campus to tell scientists in various fields from civil engineering and seismic and earthquake experts to hydrologists to climate scientists, paleoclimatologists and archaeologists, and tell them to become research assistants and to do focus groups for a report that they were being contracted by government to do. And if you were in that room and you could see the faces of those people that had dedicated their lives to already collect a lot of the data that the RAND was now wanting to utilize in that way, you would have paid $1 million to do so. So the experience of the coloniality of disaster research really hit us on the face.
Also, most of the work that we were observing was based on myths regarding host communities. For example, communities were believed to be blank canvases. They were believed to be laboratories. And the assumption was that resilience was always good. So they were kind of romanticizing the concept of resilience. However, when we talk to community leadership, they are very, very clear saying, I don't want to be resilient, because resilience being born out of neglect and governmental neglect is not good resilience. Also, one thing that we found was that there were institutions that were highly resilient that were hindering the sustainability of communities and other institutions. For example, the political parties co-opting all the decision-making processes in the island were very resilient, and that's the kind of resilience that you don't want in order to be sustainable and in order to be just. We also found a misalignment between the reality of IRBs and the reality of the disaster. How many of you know what an IRB is? I bet all of you. Institutional review boards make sure that the interactions that we have with potential participants in our research, that interaction is just and it respect the dignity of the potential participants. However, IRBs have several protected communities that require extra care in handling. For example, minors, pregnant women, incarcerated individuals, but disaster-stricken communities are not part of that list of vulnerable communities. And we found that that was a loophole because when going through IRB processes, researchers didn't have any incentive to develop extra care in interacting with these communities. And sometimes it bordered in the unethical. For example, there were universities that were embedding themselves in FEMA convoys. And when they were getting to a community that it was the first time that that community saw somebody from the outside, they were thirsty, they were hungry, they were desperate, the university researchers were starting to ask questions. And nobody told the people that their aid was tied or was not tied to answering those questions. So the assumption among the people was not that they were being participants in a research project, but that they were asking for help or requesting aid. And the last issue that we found was very fragmented student mobility efforts. Very generously, universities in the mainland were offering students from University of Puerto Rico and other universities in the island the opportunity to move to those host institutions to finish the semester or finish the year so they could continue with their studies. However, those universities were not equipped to handle the intricacies and the vulnerabilities that those climate refugees were bringing with them. For example, we met students that couple of weeks after getting to a host university, they fell into deep depression. The trauma caught up on them, right? So these universities did not have, for example, mental health facilities to help these students, with this process.
So in essence, when we leave that experience, we then did what every disaster researcher does. We looked at that event, we looked at that landscape, and we took an event type of look at our experience. 3 years after that, now we look at our COVID experience. And we see that the colony of the United States, the one that is always framed as running through modernize itself, always behind the empire in so many ways, always in the periphery of science, actually had some lessons to give the mainland before COVID. We saw before COVID the kind of attitudes in the federal government and its agencies, in the way they responded to this extreme operating environment. We saw before COVID the kind of problems in terms of intergovernmental relations that we still have in putting together plans that are of a national magnitude. We saw before COVID how local knowledge is actually put down and it's actually ignored, and how contracting and the industrial interests of the research industry, and which brings science and technology with it, how that has changed the world of the scientist into this, what Funkowitz and Ravitz call a post-normal science world. A world where there's so much uncertainty attached to futures and future scenarios. And there's so many interests involved in, and perspectives involved in the solution of these issues, that it brings science out to a place where it's never been before. So when you're a scientist, you are bound to an ethic. You are bound to a scientific method. You live in communities. You live bound to a set of rules. And we have been brought up like that as communities of science, as academic communities, to live up to those standards. However, the world around us has changed. And with that change in the world, we have now become a part of those changes, and our own institutions are being challenged every day. When Dr. Fauci speaks, they're challenged every day. When your local epidemiologist talks, they're challenged every day. When a whole society puts its hopes in one vaccine, you're challenged every day. And the analogy with the Mandalorian then becomes, I believe, a useful analogy as this extractivism that we now faced in Puerto Rico after Maria by the academic world is now being reflected in the way universities behave. behind the way of the scientific method, behind the code of collegiality, behind this still resilient, unidisciplinary way of doing things. We have tried to move to inter and transdisciplinarity. It's still difficult because it's in our core, it's even in our own design as institutions.
To finish, we proposed a new conceptual framework for disaster interventions in disasters. That conceptual framework should take into consideration that universities are critical infrastructure the same way that bridges and airports are critical infrastructure. That we should change the paradigm from observing to acting, but at the same time, we need to observe the observer. And policy entrepreneurship and multi-sectorial collaboration is necessary for vision building in order to use the disaster to transition to something else, to something better, not bringing the vulnerabilities that created the disaster in the first place. The universities need to fact check and manufacture ignorance.
Especially in a post-normal science world.
And that we need a new architecture of relationships to make science relational instead of extractive and colonial. So that new paradigm for university interventions is involve valuing the most vulnerable members of our internal and external communities, involve decolonizing science and the university, involve a new ethic based on respect, humility, and empathy. A new architecture of relationships, as I mentioned before, and observing the observer. And we are going to stop right here because what we want really is to start a conversation with you. And we know that we have consumed most of the time.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marla and Cecilio. I will help just facilitate this chat. If you have a question, I encourage you to use the raise hand icon so we can see you, and I can call on you. Holly, why don't you go ahead? Oh, sorry, Holly. I thought that was a raised hand, but it was a clap.
That's okay. I did have more of a, I hadn't quite fully formed it, so I'll throw it out. What I'm thinking, first I want to say thank you for this presentation. Really, I think while you're framing it within disaster response, I think it's also very pertinent to a lot of the conversations we have about doing research in other places and with different communities. Mm-hmm. And so I would like to just ask if you have specific recommendations or specific sort of steps forward. You've clearly thought a lot about this, but how, you know, as we move towards thinking about the co-production of knowledge and sensitivities towards communities that are both part of and subjects of our research, how do we make that transition, and how do we begin to bring that into the conversation in classrooms and so forth?
Well, the truth is that we're still thinking about that, and I don't think that we'll come to an end in that process of looking for better ways, because we consider this problem a wicked problem. So it doesn't really have a solution. Mm-hmm. We do know that there are pathways to follow. One, again, is relational in nature. Mm-hmm. We know that the learning landscape of the wildfires in California right now, and Oregon and the Western United States, has a lot to offer in terms of perspectives about what resilience is perspectives about what community building and engagement should be, that perhaps might have differences or similarities with communities in Alabama, in the Gulf region, that are now engaging in confronting a series of hurricanes. And that, however, universities haven't found a way to interconnect in a tight web of knowledge sharing and information sharing those two landscapes, those experiences. So what RISE wants to be able to develop is this tight-knit interconnection of, let's call them nodes of interconnection, where institutions of higher learning, community colleges, and different types of institutions, private institutions, can collaborate in the creation of hubs. Those hubs need to start talking to each other and to relate to each other in ways that are not only based on the frameworks of STEM, for example. If we do that, if we continue down that road, we make fiscal allocations decisions that might be shooting ourselves on the foot by not looking equally in a hierarchical way to communications research or community psychology research, or more importantly, the arts and the humanities, which continue to be now under this policy falling behind in terms of how a society values technology and how a society values humanism in the face of the uncertainties of the Anthropocene. That's just one example. So if I was going to use an analogy, the end product of RISE would be a relational radar system where no blind spot is allowed to exist. We all cover each other's backs in terms of we are the repositories of knowledge around us, whether it is the Twin Cities here with Macalester and your own neighborhoods, and which you have your own smaller web of institutions that surround you. That should be interconnected with institutions in the Caribbean, with institutions in South America, Central America, and Canada, where our students can all reflect on the realities of the other and are able to be observers of the other and observers of the observer in terms of developing new and more nuanced ways of engagement and relationship-based processes between us.
But I think the most important part is to pre-establish relationships. Given that natural events are going to be happening more frequently and in more magnitude, we cannot wait until that happens to start establishing relationships with our colleagues in those other places. So developing more closer relationships and a network of relationships to be able to then establish just and fair relationships with our colleagues during the extreme operating environment is very much needed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Is there another question out there? Maybe I could take my chair's privilege to ask a quick follow-up and let the others take a minute to articulate their question. I was really struck in your presentation, your description of groups of researchers kind of rolling up to a site and encountering people with real desperate needs and falling back on, a clipboard. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how mutual aid might be the starting point of some of these kinds of exchanges? And if that's so, how do we go about doing that? You know, I'm trying to imagine writing an NSF research grant where I list forms of mutual aid as, you know, a category of expenses that are really important to preserve our humanity for one another, but maybe take priority over a set of demographic questions or other kinds of research interventions.
Well, unfortunately, NSF is part of the problem. Through the quick response research grants, the rapid grants, they promote the immediate descending over a disaster scenario to collect what they call perishable data. And that promotes an extractive perspective or extractive attitude from the person that comes in, collects the data, the perishable data, and gets out. And the consequence is that those people that come from the outside and leave ended up being becoming the experts on that disaster situation without giving due to all the resources and the resources that they use in the locality to extract the data that they are using now.
I agree with Marla. As an institution, as a fiscal institution to promote research, NSF needs to do some critical reflection about what the role of NSF is as an institution in the Anthropocene. And I can think of a few other reasons. Incrementalism in the financing of research is not going to work anymore. At least with the kinds of series of events and years of extreme operating conditions that we're facing. But also, NSF is constantly waiting until it knows what it knows to then start letting go of financial amounts for research to happen.
It's very incremental.
Very incremental. So when you have those two things operating at the same time, you're creating really barriers for change. And that's exactly why RISE has, you know what, we've looked at the organizational structure of universities, and when we look at the literature, which really describes universities as organized anarchies, and by design, we've tried to develop RISE as a collection of affiliates and colleagues in institutions, not a collection of institutions where we go pick colleagues, because the emphasis is on the peer-to-peer community creation, and like Marla said, that has to be constant. We cannot wait until the announcement of an event comes to then you start calling people, hey, I know that you are doing this and this and this there, but I've never talked to you in the past. That doesn't work like that. So I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. The floor is open, and it would just be fine too if you wanted to just unmute yourself and ask your question directly. You don't need to raise your hand.
Or a comment will be
Please,
fine.
a comment.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Dan. Can you hear me?
Hi, Dan.
I was just thinking about your NSF discussion there, and it reminded me of how NSF has worked with small colleges in the past. When I first started at Macalester, basically, if you wanted to get funding from NSF, you had to work with a faculty member from a major research university.
Yep.
And you were added to their research grant rather than you getting your own research grant.
Mhm.
And after a number of years and I suppose lobbying from a number of people, they then took the major research grants and had a sort of cutout or hold aside for researchers at undergraduate research universities where they could be the main principal investigator on those rather than having to be under somebody else's tutelage as if they couldn't do the research themselves.
Mhm.
So I wonder if that kind of possibility might exist for a transition in how NSF sees this rather than saying, you know, these rapid research grants should be going to research facilities outside of the impact area and rather to the areas where the impact is going, where they might invite people to come in to work with them.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with your statement. And we did some research in the 6 months after Hurricane Maria, and we found that most of the rapid grants were given to outside institutions. Only 2 Puerto Rican institutions were 2 Puerto Rican researchers were PIs in rapid grants, and they belong to external research institutions. So there was no rapid grant given to local universities. And what we have found is that the same happened during Katrina in the New Orleans area and other major disasters as well.
The really colonial aspect of remnants of science and colonial science are really it's still in place and still express themselves through the coloniality of these processes. And the imagine as we speak of social justice, as we speak of reflecting on our societies in terms of structural racism and things of that sort, if we insert universities in that discussion, it's really telling that a lot of the processes that are still operating are colonial in nature, are racist in nature, and the implications for small colleges, liberal arts colleges, historically Black colleges, and Hispanic serving institutions. That is an urgent conversation to be had. If not for the location of many of those institutions being in areas of high risk, for example, in coastal environments, in other risk areas. But again, for the students and the populations that habitate those communities, as the same as we're looking the unequal effects of COVID on populations of color, and that is tantamount to what we're seeing here in terms of the impact of these behaviors, institutional behaviors, on people of color, on institutions that represent those communities of color. And truthfully, we don't see in our future, we don't see really radical change unless we come together in a frank conversation between universities and tackle this up front. RISE, let me tell you, is not a happy, joy, let's join our hands, kumbaya type of effort or concept. It's a disruptive concept. And it's a concept that emerges from disillusionment. It emerges from our own necessity to de-link ourselves from what we see are processes that are still very colonial in nature. And so those of you that might go to therisenetwork.org. And as you read through our webpage, you see a series of postulates that you would like to adhere to. And if you hit, I accept these postulates and I would like to join the RISE network, I want you to be clear. It's a rocky and bumpy road ahead. And it's been 3 years of going against the grain and asking questions that were uncomfortable in very comfortable places. That doesn't gain you a lot of friends in high places. But what we've seen is that as we observe the observer, that also has an impact on the observed. And we both go together in this journey of exploration where justice and equity is put at the forefront of that journey. And to this day, some of the little things that we do as a network to be able to create change, such as joining in classes of each other and coming in and talking to our own students and the students of our other colleagues. Little things like that, they start seeds down below that later on are really unstoppable in nature. So that's in a glimpse, that's where this network wants to go in the creation of that, what we call a mesonet of radar universities that can give us shed light and not allow manufactured ignorance to decide who comes out on top of who after disasters or in life as a whole.
Christy, I saw that you had a question, but maybe I could just pause and see if any of the students that are attending right now want to jump in with a comment, an observation, a question for our guests.
Just a note of appreciation. I think when we had, like, in my high school experience, whenever we talked about like interventions as, non-government organizations and so on, it was obviously less academic, but this was a very important, case that we looked at. And again, I really appreciate the 6 points. It was very clear and it was very insightful. So thank you, not just like in the academic sense, but also in general sort of interventions. Do we flood natural calamity hit areas with materials that we think people need, versus actually saying, okay, what's the local economy like? Are we, completely wiping out what local people could be doing? So yeah, no, I think the points were very well thought out, and I just wanted to thank you for this amazing presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Christy, do you want to go ahead? And I would just ask if both the question and the reply could be brief, since we're running up against the clock.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cecilio and Marla. I'm very curious to hear more about your critique of the concept of resilience.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a number of colleagues in Latin American studies and in other that we're thinking of making that an activity next semester. So we don't want to give out too much, but
No, basically, our critique is that we tend to believe that resilience is always a good thing. And we tend to romanticize the concept of resilience, and it's not necessarily so. It's not always good, not necessarily good. And as I mentioned during the presentation, when you have to be resilient because of the neglect of the state or other social institutions that are there to make you survive this kind of event, then that's not good resilience. That's a resilience of a scarcity, basically. Also, when you have institutions that co-opt your processes, your decision-making processes, those institutions are really resilient, and you don't want them to be resilient. You want to kill them, basically. And that's what we meant when we say that we romanticize the concept.
Of course, there's the if we make this discussion too scientific and too academic, you fall prey into just challenging each other's definition of what it is. And true, there's some major issues that we still have to work out there, but that doesn't really challenge the concept. That's just how you define it. But what we have found, though, is that attached to this, I will say the same word, romanticizing the hardness of things and the technological aspects of things as magic wands that one can utilize to bring about transformations or even transitions to a more resilient world. We have forgotten that those technological ways of looking at resilience, as returning to normal. Now we're questioning normality as a society. What is normality? But even when you say building back stronger, so like Marla said, you might be strengthening regimes that actually need destruction, and so these definitions are limiting. And one definition that we are trying as RISE to put forward is a definition that actually puts more importance on how we participate in handling uncertainty in our future than on hardening or in artifacts creation of material culture. So we say that resilience for us is the governance of uncertainty. So we do challenge the current definitions of resiliency, but we do it by trying to bring everybody to the table, and perhaps we're not going to get consensus, and perhaps we don't want consensus, but we do want this open dialogue and constant reflection on what uncertainty means to me in the South Bronx, or what it means to me in the mountains of central Puerto Rico, and what it means to me in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. And we might find that exposing our students to those different visions of resiliency help us challenge the current definitional complexity, and we might get a clearer picture of resilience than if we keep it inside our ivory tower.
In a very plain way, resilience means your ability or your capacity to withstand a beating, basically, not to question where that beating comes from. So what we are saying is that within the concept of resilience, you should pay attention to where that beating comes from.
In other words, we need to put politics in. That's what she meant.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you especially Marla and Cecilio today. Maybe this is a time for a little round of clapping like we would do in our normal classroom. So I'm going to conclude this session and encourage you to get to know both of them better. So Cecilio, this module is teaching energy justice course, and he's got a series of speakers who show up every Wednesday. He's made those speakers available to the entire community for us to listen in. So if you'd like to get that list and figure out how you can listen in, it's at 1:45 on Wednesdays. I'd encourage you to get in touch. Next semester, he's going to be teaching a seminar on resilience. So that's a place where you can go for more, with a focus on the Caribbean and a place to think more deeply about the Puerto Rico examples we heard about today. Marla is going to be teaching in Module 2, a course on environmental sociology. It's already full, bursting at the seams, so instead I'm going to point you to her spring semester course on disaster sociology. The last thing I wanted to note, and I recognize we're out of time here, is that we've chosen to devote our Envirothursday seminar series this fall, and maybe even this spring, to thinking about issues of racism, anti-racism, justice, and equity. And so this was the first in this thematic set of conversations this fall. I wanted to invite you to the next one, which will be on October 8th, when we will introduce the artwork for the Smale Gallery's new installation for 2020 and 2021. This is a student-curated gallery focused on the themes of resilience, so very connected to what we talked about today. The photographs are stunning, they are thought-provoking, they are from around the world, and really give us a window into what the student experience has been like over this last 6 months. So I invite you back on October 8th. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.